Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event on the topic of truth, justice, and the science of gender with our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Alice Dreger. Our event this evening is part of a fall series of events at St. Olaf College on the larger theme of discrimination and the search for justice and truth. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm professor of religion and philosophy at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute sponsoring our event this evening and the fall series just mentioned. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and encourage free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing our event, very special thanks go to the excellent staff of the Institute, Tanya Charlotte Paley, whom you've just heard from, Assistant Director of the Institute, and Administrative Assistant Dawn Bartz. Their indispensable contributions are deeply appreciated. Thanks also to Molly Work and Carrie Vanderveen of St. Olaf Marketing and Communications, and to Jeff O'Donnell, Jason Wyatt, and the Broadcast Media Services crew for their contributions. Thanks also to St. Olaf students for helping us tonight, Jacob Betcher, Chris Hodel, and Meredith Maloli. Finally, thanks to the St. Olaf faculty and students of courses that have integrated their study with our event this evening, and to the St. Olaf faculty who participated in a one-week seminar this past summer on topics related to the theme of our discussion tonight. We are very pleased to have with us Dr. Alice Dreger, who is a prominent historian of science, journalist, public intellectual, and passionate advocate for the rights of intersex persons, transgender persons, and members of other historically marginalized communities. Alice Dreger earned her PhD in History and Philosophy of Science at Indiana University, Bloomington in 1995. For a period of time, she was a tenured professor at Michigan State University, where she was also winner of a prestigious Teacher Scholar Award. And for 10 years, from 2005 to 2015, she was a professor in Northwestern University's Medical Humanities and Bioethics program. Until, that is, she resigned in protest over circumstances surrounding the Northwestern's administration's attempt to censor a publication she was editing. Currently, Alice is an independent scholar, writer, and activist, and founding editor of, as well as writer for, a local newspaper in East Lansing, Michigan, where she now resides. She has authored numerous articles and books, including, among the books, Intersex and the Age of Ethics, published by the University Publishing Group in 1999, and a book entitled One of Us, Conjoined Twins and the Future of Normal, published by Harvard University Press in 2005. Her most widely discussed book is entitled, provocatively, Galileo's Middle Finger, Heretics, Activists, and One Scholar's Search for Justice, originally published by Penguin Press in 2015 and reissued by Penguin Books with a new afterword in 2016. The book has received a host of positive reviews in a number of prestigious journals and magazines, such as The New Yorker, Nature, New York Magazine, Science, Human Nature, Forbes, and Salon. The book was named Editor's Choice by the New York Times Book Review and spawned 2 Chronicle of Higher Education articles characterizing Alice as a star scholar and as a reluctant crusader. Reluctant, I presume, because the controversies surrounding her work generally have made at times for an unpleasant, embattled, discursive environment, one in which she has felt occasionally the pressures of institutional power, and an environment in which she has often been the recipient of strident, hostile criticism, sometimes from certain members of the very communities, ironically enough, she has tried to defend. Indeed, in recognition of her resolve in challenging circumstances, the Heterodox Academy of 2018 awarded Alice Dreger its very first Open Mind Award for Courage. As the award indicates, throughout her career, She has been an indefatigable champion of freedom, freedom of inquiry in the academy and the society at large, and a champion of the freedom of individuals, especially marginalized persons, to live their lives as they see fit, so long as such living does not harm others or impede the freedom of others. She has many other noteworthy accomplishments, some of which are listed in the program for this event, but will you now join me in welcoming our very distinguished guest, Alice Dreger.
Now I feel like I need a nap after listening to all that.
I've got some more to say.
You say I'm not tireable. That makes me tired to listen to.
Alice, a question. Debates about gender and race that have roiled colleges and universities in recent years have raised a number of questions, at least implicitly, about the nature and purpose of the academy. Is higher education essentially about free and open inquiry and pursuit of truth? Or is it about the promotion of social justice? Or is it about both? Or is it about neither? Are truth and justice always compatible ideals? Some have argued that these two ideals, truth and justice, can conflict, and that higher education's central purpose should be the untrammeled pursuit of truth, perhaps even at the possible expense of justice in certain moments. A man named Jonathan Haidt has argued that recently. Others have proposed that truth is just a social construct anyway, a construct appeal to which is sometimes employed to preserve unjust power arrangements, and thus a construct that invites deconstruction or radical reconstruction or even rejection for the sake of social justice. Still others propose that there can be no genuine conflict between truth and justice, that the free pursuit of truth requires justice and vice versa. Justice requires the free pursuit of truth. In your book, you take a stand on the relationship between truth and justice, both in the academy and in society at large. What's the stand you take on truth and justice? Why do you take the stand you do? And how does your position on that matter relate to issues and questions you've addressed as an historian of sexuality and gender science? One more sentence. Maybe we can start with the heated controversy over, which I will say has been somewhat controversial in the reception of your being here tonight. The heated controversy over the concept of autogynephilia as it may or may not apply to the experiences and identities of transgender persons. What is all this about?
Luckily, he showed me this final exam question before he launched it upon me. I read it on the way to Minnesota, and the plane was landing while I was still finishing reading this question. Okay, so just by way of background, for those of you who don't know my history, I'll give it to you really short, encapsulated. I grew up in a Roman Catholic family, and my parents were right-to-life activists, so I was raised on abortion picket lines. And my parents dragged the 4 kids along in part because the police would not arrest them if they had 4 kids, because the police didn't want to deal with 4 young children. My dad ended up running for Congress on the right-to-life party line. He got, I think, 3% of the vote, which was actually significant because it drew votes away from other groups. I was raised by a woman who was a feminist, who was part of the group Feminists for Life, and I took the feminism part but left the anti-abortion part. I became an atheist. Well, I didn't become. I was always an atheist. I never developed any faith. My sister is a Roman Catholic nun and a physician, and I am a sex researcher atheist. So we're a weird family. There was, in fact, one day where my sister and I were sitting on the couch together, and my mother said, my sex researcher atheist daughter and my Roman Catholic nun physician daughter, what happened? And I said to my mother, well, you raised one of us, right? And there was a pause, and I said, would you like me to make you a gin and tonic? And she said yes, and I said, see? My sister puts up with these jokes. So I ended up dropping out of school when I was 19. I went to Georgetown for a year because I was sick of people telling me what to think and do and write about. So I became a mortgage broker at the age of 19, and I did that for 5 years, and then I ended up going to graduate school in history and philosophy of science. And when I did that, I was still very interested in feminism, and so my dissertation director suggested that I look at the history of what had happened with people who had been labeled hermaphrodites in the late 19th century. So these are people born not with standard male or standard female bodies, but with something in between. And that was really interesting because nobody had looked at that history. So I started doing that work, and people who had been born intersex started, that's the modern day term for it, started to contact me and ask me to help me change the current day medical system. And I said, I do dead people, I don't do living people, but I had been raised to be a awake person who responded to injustice in the world. My parents were very much interested in responding to injustice in the world, and I kept that in my person. So I started looking at what was happening in the medical system, and I was horrified to discover that patients were lied to about their medical histories, that they were subjected to very invasive surgeries that they didn't need, that often they had disrupted relationships with their parents and with their bodies because of things that had been done in an attempt to normalize them. So I became part of the intersex rights movement and did that for many years, ultimately for about 20 years. And as I was wrapping up helping lead the Intersex Society of North America, I started to look for a new project, and the project I ended up doing was a controversy over transgenderism. I knew people on both sides of that controversy, and so it was really interesting to me that they were telling me two totally different versions of the same story. And as a historian, that's a really interesting thing to look at, because it's something where there seems to be a single event, and yet people have completely different views of it. So that was the controversy over Michael Bailey's book, a book called The Man Who Would Be Queen. And the most controversial part of that book was the look at a type of sexual orientation called autogynephilia. And what autogynephilia is usually used for if you're born a natal male, so you're born biologically male, but you end up feeling that there's a feminine component to you, specifically that you're sexually aroused by the idea of being or becoming a woman. And that may sound really strange and unusual, but if you're like me and you've looked at human sex, all human sex is strange and unusual. By the time you're done with it, you realize everybody looks odd when you look from a distance. Autogynephilia doesn't look strange to me anymore because I've come to understand it as just another human sexual orientation within the possibilities of human life. And in this case, what happens is people who are autogynephilic have an interest in having sexual orientation typically with women, so interest in having sex that we in sex research call gynephilic, meaning attracted to females, but are also interested in being female. And some people live a bigendered life, and some people actually transition and become transgendered women. The way that Bailey wrote about this was a way of writing about it that was pretty confrontational and pretty intense. He chose the most extreme sort of version of it and ended up portraying that in his book, and it created a controversy in which a group of transgender women came after him and accused him of many different ethical violations. When I came to the story, I didn't know Michael Bailey, and so I started doing this investigation. And over the course of a year, I discovered that all of the charges against him were in fact made up. And that the reason they were made up was because the group of women who had come after him wanted to shut him up about this concept. So I ended up writing an expose, and they came after me. And that was a very disruptive period of my life, because basically they did things like create blogs that appeared to be written by me but said horrific things like I wanted to send intersex and transgender people to the gas chambers. They went after my family. They accused me of being a tool of the Catholic Church, which cracked me up because my parents would be delighted if I was a tool of the Catholic Church. They went after my sister. They threatened me in various ways such that I had to call the police. It totally disrupted my life. And yet I understood where they were coming from. Where they were coming from was a place of feeling very misrepresented and very misunderstood. So I totally understood where they were coming from. And I was actually sympathetic to the issue that they were facing, which was feeling completely abused in the system in terms of the way that they were being represented. So I ended up doing the book Galileo's Middle Finger, which was an exploration of other academics like me who had been beset upon by social justice activists. And that's the reason why I engage in this question of what should the academy be about? Should the academy be about the search for truth? In other words, should we be very hard, trying all the time to, in fact, pursue knowledge, new knowledge, through various kinds of disciplines? Or should we, in fact, be using the place of the academy, which is an extraordinarily beautiful place, a very special place particularly within the American system, to bring forward social justice issues and try to change the world, to make the world better, particularly for people who've been historically abused. I am extremely sympathetic to both sides, and yet at the same time, I do increasingly feel that we've gone too far in the academy in terms of putting the pursuit of justice before the pursuit of truth. And the reason I say that is because there are actually other places in the world where you can, in fact, pursue justice. And there are very few places in the world today where you can pursue truth without having somebody tell you what you are and are not allowed to study, and telling you what you are and are not allowed to do. And the example of that is the fact that I had to resign from Northwestern, and we can talk about that if you want to talk about that more. But the controversy over autogynephilia is now a very difficult Gordian knot to try to even talk about. And the reason is because people mean many different things when they talk about it. When I talk about it, I see it as a sexual orientation that is actually fairly common, we've discovered, and is also, I think, just another sexual orientation. And my own feeling is that when we think about sex, we have to think about two things. We have to think about pleasure, and we have to think about consent. And in the case of autogynephilia, those things are non-problematic. It brings people pleasure to enact that sexual orientation, and it does not violate somebody's consent as long as you're doing whatever you're doing sexually with the permission of anybody else that you're participating in a sexual encounter with. There's no problem. So it does not present the kind of problem that some types of sexual orientations do. Pedophilia, for example, is a morally problematic thing to enact. We know that pedophilia is not a chosen sexual orientation. We also know, unfortunately, that it's not changeable as far as we can tell. We can dampen down somebody's pedophilic urges, but we can't appear to change the way that they feel in terms of what turns them on. In that case, enacting that orientation is morally and legally and ethically extremely problematic. It's not okay to enact. So that creates a much more difficult situation in terms of trying to think about how we deal with the fact that there are people who have that orientation and they did not choose it and they don't want it and they need to not act on it, but we have to recognize that it exists. So autogynephilia, to me, is a very unproblematic orientation. It, in fact, is a lot like a lot of other orientations, like, for example, being a heterosexual female or being a homosexual male, that as long as you are pursuing pleasure and you are engaging in a way that you have consent of the people that you are engaging with, I don't see that there's any problem. So that doesn't mean other people don't think that when I speak of it, I am in fact speaking of something that is extremely oppressive and dangerous and causes them to feel marginalized because they believe that that is not something anybody could ever feel okay about. What do we do about the issue of truth and justice? I think within the academy, we have to be very, very careful to recognize that if universities are destroyed, for example, through corporatization and corporate branding, which is happening at more and more colleges and universities, we will still have other places in the world where we can do social justice, but we will have very few places in the world where we can pursue truth. And that, to me, is a very frightening thing because I don't think you can have justice without knowing what is true in the world. In other words, I don't think we can try to figure out how to make sure that we have justice around climate issues if we don't understand climate issues. We can't pursue, for example, the end of environmental racism, which is when we have a situation where minority populations disproportionately are subject to environmental pollution, if we don't understand environmental pollution and we don't understand the way in which there's disparities. So we need to have the academy in order to understand how we even begin to enact justice.
Do you think, though, that there are some areas of inquiry which are dangerous from the point of view of justice? So, for example, a project that is focused on correlating IQ scores and race, or the investigation of gender differences with respect to mathematical abilities and these kinds of things. I mean, these are the kinds of issues that have generated some of the kind of intense exchanges about these matters in the academy. I mean, what do you say to someone who says, look, there are certain areas of inquiry that it's just, if it's not forbidden knowledge, it's probably best just to stay away from that kind of project because we just don't know what's going to happen as a consequence of our investigation. What do you say about people who have that kind of worry?
I never want to forbid somebody from researching something, but at the same time, there are certainly things I would try to talk somebody out of researching. And race and IQ is one of them. The reason being that it's very difficult for me to conceive of a type of production of knowledge in that area that would be useful. So we were talking earlier, for example, say you found in doing a careful study of race and IQ that in fact white people are stupider than people of color. What usefulness would come out of that? To my mind, if you had somebody who was a white racist, that's not going to persuade them at all. And it could actually be used in harmful ways, right, to discriminate against people or to change resource distribution in ways that could be problematic in terms of a justice approach. So I actually think I would try to encourage somebody who's approaching something like that to really examine the question, can this lead to good? But not all research has to begin with the question of, can it lead to good? I think there are types of research which are sort of close to pure research in the sense that you're trying to figure something out just for the sake of figuring it out. But we have a limited amount of resources, and there's some things that don't seem worth providing resources towards compared to other issues. So it seems to me we can talk together and make a decision. The other problem is, of course, in the application of knowledge. So when you actually look at something like race, race turns out to be this incredibly complicated thing. Yes, there are biological differences in terms of where people come from. Those exist. But when you begin to look at the question of what race is, it actually turns out to be like sex. It's actually really complicated. And certainly when you look at something like IQ, that's actually not a simple thing. It's incredibly complicated to look at the way that intelligence develops. But what you end up with is these sort of soundbite ideas of, we found these differences between this race, and this is a simplistic difference. And then that ends up in an application. And the application really dumbs down the knowledge. So one of the things that we have to engage with as researchers is an attempt to understand, when our work is being turned into policy, in what ways is our work really being oversimplified and abused. And that's something where I'm really excited that more and more scientists are going into politics, because I think we have the potential to have much better public policy if what we have is people who have thought more carefully about what knowledge really is.
So your view is not, as I'm hearing you speak now, your view is not that free inquiry into determining what is true is an intrinsic good, that in some sense it's got to be connected to a larger social goal or social project.
No, I like pointless research. I've really come to love pointless research. Every now and then I run into a medieval scholar who's studying some incredibly obscure text and thrills the heck out of me, because I think it is such a wonderful sign that we have reached the point where we can do that as a human species, where we can basically study stuff that has no meaning at some level, where the only purpose of it is that that scholar is really fascinated by it, really excited by it, really interested in it, and they're going to work on it for a while. That to me is a sign of true human progress, that we can pursue things that is just crazy, obscure, and weird. And we should allow for that, I think. And the reason we should allow for that is the same reason we allow for art, right? Art, it's difficult to say what purpose art has. In some circumstances, a particular piece of art has a very clear meaning. So, for example, a particular play might really help us think about, for example, an issue of sexual harassment. So there have been plays around the whole issue that a sexual encounter can happen and two people can have completely different views of what exactly happened in that. That can really help us think about those things. But there's a lot of art where the point is not entirely clear. And I think that's okay. That's part of what it means to be a really advanced civilization, is to say, we're going to have people doing some stuff, and the purpose of it is really unclear, and it may have no purpose, and that's okay. And the university system and college system is one of the last places where we can do that kind of pointless work. And I think it's really important that we retain the place for work that appears pointless, but has meaning to the individual working on it.
So it would be, but in certain cases, a certain kind of pointless knowledge might be, as one envisages it, what might be put to bad use. And if there are signs of that up front, I'm hearing you say that that should be discouraged.
Yeah. Well, what I would say is I think we should all stay aware of how it is what we're working on could be abused. It's true you can't perfectly predict the way your work is going to be used, but you can make some good educated guesses. And if what you could educatedly guess is that your work is going to lead to significant harm, then I think you have a moral responsibility to consider not doing it. So, for example, say you're somebody who is studying a particular issue in agriculture and you are working on something that kills everything within a given environment. Well, what do you think that's going to be used for? Odds are that's going to be weaponized and used as a weapon, like Agent Orange. I think it's reasonable to say, do you really want to work on that? Do you really want to work on something that basically is going to lead to probably the purpose of using it against people to basically starve and kill them and to destroy their environment? I think you can ask that question and decide, no, that's not something worth working on.
If we get back to the issue of autogynephilia, I mean, the way you were describing that as a possible motivation for transgender transition sounded perfectly reasonable, liberating, positive. Why would anybody have any reservations about it? What precisely has gotten certain members of the transgender community so angry about what you have proposed or what this science is postulating?
Historically speaking, transgender people were often denied the right to have access to therapies that would allow them to have better lives. And so there are two major types of interventions that you can have to have a better life if you are a transgender person, if you want those interventions. One is hormone therapy, which is cross-sex hormones, and the other one is the type of interventions that can change your sexed body characteristics. So, for example, change your chest or your breasts, do what is called top surgery or bottom surgery, change your genitals. Historically speaking, the way the American medical establishment set this up was to basically decide that they wanted only to allow transition for people who would pass as straight people at the end of it. And so they greatly restricted clinical access to interventions to only go to those people who were going to pass in the system of the heterosexual norms. The consequence of that was leaving out a lot of people who could have benefited from access to transition and also denigrating their experiences. So one of the reactions to that, which was a very reasonable reaction among transgender activists and their allies, was to desexualize transgenderism, to say it's not about sexuality, it's about gender. And it is about gender. It absolutely is about gender. And in many cases, it's also about sexual orientation, which I think should not be a problem. We should all be allowed to have sexual orientations, sexual experiences, and genders, right? We shouldn't be denied that. But the reaction was to desexualize transgenderism, to stop talking about transsexualism and change the terminology to talk about transgender, to stop talking about sex reassignment surgeries and start talking about gender-affirming surgeries, which is a very different way of thinking about it. So when people like Michael Bailey come along and then talk about the sexual aspects of it, it feels very dangerous, like it's going to lead to a backwards approach. And in fact, it does in some circumstances. So there's a psychiatrist, for example, at Johns Hopkins University, Paul McHugh, who is totally against allowing anybody to have access to transgender interventions like hormone therapies and surgical changes. And the reason he says is because it's a type of delusion. And as far as he's concerned, doing those kinds of interventions is like doing weight loss surgery on a person who's anorexic. It's denying the core problem, which is a misunderstanding of what your body really is. I think McHugh is absolutely wrong, and the reason I think he's wrong is because of the science that people like Ray Blanchard, who coined autogynephilia, have gone out and collected, which is to say that evidence they've collected is to say for people who are reasonably well screened and who want those interventions, they do better afterwards. They're better off. An anorexic, given weight loss surgery, is not going to be better off, right? But a transgender person who is able to get access to cross-gender hormones and cross-gender surgeries, who's able to get that, actually is going to be better off on average. It doesn't mean everybody is, but on average, they're going to be better off. And so what's happened is this sort of very convoluted conversation about what is safe to talk about. The people like Blanchard and Bailey, who are sex researchers, don't really care that some people might feel that that's unsafe to talk about sexual orientation, and they reject the idea that that's really what's going on for them. They feel that the issue going on is primarily an issue of gender. What's interesting is if you actually look at the way both sides are talking, I actually see them beginning to merge. So, for example, people like Mike Bailey and Ray Blanchard talk more and more, in my experience, about the importance of gender in that orientation. So they're talking more and more about the idea that, in fact, the way you feel as a woman is very relevant to the way you're experiencing your sexual life. And on the other side, what I see is the transgender activists who've been against them talking more and more about sexual life mattering in a much more open way. And so I think we're beginning actually to get to a better place where we can actually talk more clearly about the fact that for most of us, our sexual orientations involve our genders. So if you think about your own sexuality for a moment, I'm not going to ask you to share, but if you think about your own sexuality for a moment, odds are for most of us, there's a gendered component. So when I'm having sex with a man, I'm a straight woman. When I'm doing that, I'm actually doing that as a woman. And what I mean by that is I actually think when we're having a sexual encounter is when our gender is most vividly felt. So in the average moment of the day, I'm not thinking to myself, I'm a woman, I'm a woman, I'm a woman. But when I'm in a sexual encounter, I feel my gender rather intensely. I feel very womanly in some way. I think for a person who is autogynephilic, she's feeling something similar to what I'm feeling. She's feeling very intensely her feminine gender. And so to my mind, we are analogous in the sense that our gender identities are very salient in our sexual experiences. And I think we're finally beginning to be able to talk about that. For some people, gender doesn't really matter in their sexual orientation. What arouses them is not something about gender, it's something else entirely. But for many of us, gender matters in our orientations.
When you were characterizing the critique of certain members of the transgender community of the concept of autogynephilia, it sounded like a kind of moral critique, a worry that there is going to be a certain kind of abuse if this theory is acted on or introduced into clinical practice and that kind of thing. But sometimes I hear members of this community arguing not on the basis of moral principles, but making the claim that the science lying behind autogynephilia is lousy, it's bad, it's like climate denial, that sort of thing. Serrano is a person who has advanced this argument. Where are we in your view on the matter of the science lying behind these autogynephilia claims?
I wish we were farther along, but we can't be because it's actually not an area that is easy to study anymore because the controversies have gotten so intense that people can't do it without destroying their careers immediately. So there are just about 2 people, I think, now that are actually studying orientation within these areas. And other than that, it's virtually impossible to study. So I don't think we're going to have better science anytime soon. That said, one of the things that made me inclined to look very carefully at Blanchard's work about this when I was doing the Bailey study was the fact that the 3 major activists who went after Bailey, I show in the book, all had expressed something that looks very much like what Blanchard describes as autogynephilic feelings in their own writing prior to these attacks. And yet after the attacks, they totally denied that they ever felt that way, even though they had left behind writings. In one case, the chief attacker actually had written a letter to Anne Lawrence, who we were talking about earlier, and had actually said, I fully sort of own my own autogynephilic experiences. I just think Blanchard has a little bit wrong. So one of the things that happened for me was realizing, all these people had been admitting this feeling prior to the message coming down. We're not supposed to talk about this. We're not allowed to talk about this, and shutting down the dialogue completely. The other thing is, as I was telling Ed earlier, when I hang out with people who are clinicians in this area, many of them tell me, we all know that this is correct, but we're not supposed to talk about it because our patients feel like we're not hearing them if we use this kind of language. But part of the reason we need to talk about the way that people come to be transgender is because it not only matters in terms of taking their lives seriously, it also matters in terms of understanding for whom transition might work. So one of the things people have a myth about with regard to transgender is that you either are or you aren't. But for a lot of people who are approaching the possibility of transgender, they're not sure. They're gender questioning, they may be gender nonconforming, they may be gender non-binary. They're not sure if those kinds of interventions and legal and social change make sense for them. one of the things we know is that for people who have an orientation that is an autogynephilic orientation, they're more likely to turn out not to have the same level of benefit. Now, does that mean they should be denied it? Absolutely not, because many, many, many will benefit. But it should be part of the informed consent process to say, okay, this is where you're coming from. And what you should know is that some people do turn out to regret going through transition. So we want you to keep in mind that maybe this isn't the right choice for you, or maybe it is, but let's try to figure out what's the best thing possible for you. So it used to be the case that it was very difficult for transgender people to get the access to the interventions they wanted and needed. That was terrible. What we've had now is a pendulum swinging very far in the other direction, where there's a lot less screening than there used to be. And now we're beginning to see people who went through transition and regret it. And that's bad. It's not just bad because you've now done things to your body that you can't undo. It's bad because the people who are anti-transgender rights will use their stories to deny everybody else access. And we see them doing this. So we want to reduce and eliminate the regret as much as possible, because if we can make sure everybody is doing well afterwards, then the people who are going to try to deny them their rights will have nothing to base that on. That said, even with the regret cases, the regret level among transgender interventions is so low compared to the regret rate for many other medical interventions. So if we look at the regret rate, for example, for weight loss surgeries, or we look at the regret rate for some kinds of cosmetic surgeries, we find a much higher regret rate than we do among people who get transgender interventions. So all in all, it's a very successful medical assistance intervention. But that said, if we swing so far in the other direction that people are not screened at all and not taken care of, what we're going to find is more and more people regretting. And that is something I think we have to try to avoid. So we have to really be careful. The other thing we're hearing from people who have been through recent transitions, for some of them, they say, you know, I went into a clinic to get help, and I expressed gender questions, and immediately I was sort of cataloged as, oh, well, so you're transgender, so we're going to help you, and we're going to send you down this road. And they paid no attention to my other needs. Sometimes people have histories of trauma. Sometimes they have anxiety. Sometimes they have other things going on. But the attitude is, oh, this is just one of those, and so we'll just send people down that route, and it doesn't actually address their core needs. So may transition help in those cases? Absolutely, yes. But that's not enough for a lot of people who need more than that, who need better care than simply saying, we're going to give you access to interventions that are hormonal interventions and surgical interventions, and then that's going to solve all of your problems. No, if you have a history of having been abused sexually, or you have a history of trauma, or you have a history of some other issue that you need help with, that's not going to solve that. That's just going to deal with part of your life but not actually help you. So how can we make sure that everybody is being truly cared for in the system and getting the interventions that will be the best interventions for them?
Okay, we're approaching the time for general Q&A. Before we get to that, could you say a little bit about the censorship issue with Northwestern, what prompted you to resign, what the issues were, so forth?
Sure. So we're going to talk about a blowjob, okay? That happened in 1973. I did not participate. I would have been 8 years old. So what happened was I was editing a magazine/journal for my unit at Northwestern, which is the Medical Humanities and Bioethics unit in the medical school at Northwestern. And this was a magazine/journal we called Atrium. And it was a very edgy once or twice a year publication in which we explored a theme in the medical humanities. And the themes were things like the liminal, power, unmentionables, and we rotated who got to do the chief editing for any given issue. So my turn came up, and the person who was in charge of the journal suggested to me that I take the theme of bad girls, which was the theme we had been batting around. And this was perfect for me because I had done a lot of stuff in gender, and I love the idea of questioning the idea of what made a girl bad. Like, even the term girl is pretty loaded because it's a term that, of my generation, we would not want it to be called girls. We want it to be called women, not girls. So the word girls was very interesting to me, and the word bad is really interesting because bad, of course, can be used to actually compliment somebody as opposed to criticize them. So I was given the task of going out and collecting essays for this, and I did the usual. The group of faculty went through and did a call for proposals, and we sent that out, and we got about 30-something, I think 35 proposals back. And out of that, I could only choose about 12 or 13 for the size of the journal. So one of the pieces that came back was actually fully written essay by a cultural anthropologist and disability studies scholar named Bill Peace. Bill actually died recently. And Bill was spinal cord injured. He was born with a neurological condition that was degenerative, and at the age of 18, he basically became paralyzed from the waist down. So he was 18 years old in the early 1970s, and in the early 1970s was an interesting time. It was a time of the sexual revolution, the drug revolution. There was a lot of rapid change occurring in the culture. And he ended up in a rehabilitation facility, which at that time was a relatively new thing. And he was housed with a bunch of other men who also had paralysis. And he started asking his physicians, am I going to be able to have sex? Am I going to be able to be a father? And they basically didn't answer him because they didn't want to talk about sex. So he and the other guys, of course, would talk about sex. And he wrote in this piece for me about how it was that one of the things that happened was that very intense relationships developed, because these were guys basically not in a hospital. They were in sort of a halfway kind of house being, quote unquote, rehabilitated. And they ended up in very close relationships with each other and also with the nursing staff. And so he became friends with one of the nurses who came upon him one night when he thought he had finally gotten bladder control under control, and he actually had not, and he pissed himself all over the bed, and he was distraught and crying, and he hit the nurse call button to get help changing the sheets. And this woman that he was very good friends with came, and she realized that he was sexually very distraught, and she wanted to prove to him everything was going to be okay. So she gave him oral sex and brought him to orgasm and assured him that this is proof. Your penis works, your ejaculatory system works, you can be a father. And he felt very, very grateful to her. And so he wrote about this, and he wasn't writing about this for us in 2014 to say this is the way stuff should be in medicine. He was clear that this is something we would never accept today. But his point was that this was a weird, strange moment in the history of medicine. And as a historian of medicine, I found it incredibly interesting. As somebody who had done disability studies and sex studies, I found it incredibly interesting to read about this. And I started asking other men with disabilities if they had had the same experience. And the men of that generation were telling me, yeah, I didn't do that, but there were guys in the same system. People had married their nurses. This existed. So he was telling this story to talk about this as the Wild West period of rehabilitation medicine. But he was raising the question, do we today deal with the sexual needs of people with disabilities in terms of simply answering their questions, in terms of providing them hope that they can still have sexual lives in the future? So we published the issue, and it also had some pieces on abortion. It had pieces on transgender life in Samoa. It had stuff about women who birth outside of the medical care system. It was this very intense issue, as all the issues were of Atrium. And after it was published, 3,000 issues went out as this high gloss thing. It goes online. A few months later, my dean picks it up and starts reading it and gets to that article, which, by the way, had the hilarious title, Head Nurses. I thought it was funny. I'm not squeamish. I mean, I've studied sex for a long time. So he reads it and he freaks out, and he apparently decided that this might violate a branding agreement he had made with Northwestern Memorial Hospital when he basically sold the medical school to the hospital. And so he ordered it censored. This was not theoretical censorship. This had already gone out and it was censored. He could not pull back the 3,000 copies that had gone out, but he could pull it offline, and he did. And I was told, shut up, don't talk about it. Now, I'm not good at shut up, don't talk about it, but I was nervous about my colleagues who needed the jobs more than I needed it. And I stayed quiet for a long time, and my colleague Christy Kirshner started fighting with me. Christy is a rehabilitation physician and also a disability studies scholar, and she had done a great piece for us about women's sexuality in the same issue. So she and I were both outraged that this was being censored, because the irony of it, right? So here's the irony of it. Bill was writing about how doctors had basically tried to silence his sexuality. And what was happening? My dean, who was a physician, was telling Bill he was not able to talk about his sexual history, that it was not okay to talk about it. And I was like, this is too ironic. On top of that, I had just published a book about academic freedom. So I'm in this really awkward position, right, where I've called everybody to defend their academic freedom, and my dean is censoring my work. So after putting up with this for a long time, I basically went in. My book was actually just coming out at this point, and I went in and had a meeting with the dean's office. The head dean wouldn't meet with me, but the other deans would meet with me. And I basically showed them the thing about, the jacket for the book, and I was like, you really don't want to censor me. This is just going to get awkward. I'm going to have to call you out on it, and I really think you should fix it and undo the censorship. To my colleagues' credit, my departmental colleagues decided to pull off the entire set of Atrium offline to basically say, if you're going to censor one of us, you're going to censor everything. But they didn't say publicly what was going on. So there was sort of like this silent protest that I did not find particularly useful. Anyway, they thought I was a nobody because I was a part-time long-distance employee, and apparently they'd never heard of Google, so they had no idea what I was used to doing, which was calling out BS in the universe. And so they did not turn it around, and my colleague Christy Kirshner quit in protest of this, and I quit a few months after her. And basically we went public with it and told everybody that the dean had censored this piece and that we found it outrageous because we had academic freedom. And this piece was not, believe me, this piece was not pornography. And even if it had been, I would raise the question of whether or not, we have some rights in terms of being able to talk about things that make people sexually interested. But this was not. This was a guy who had lost bladder control and urinated all over himself. This was not terribly sexy as a story. It was a story of compassion, of sexual compassion. But the dean decided to stick with it, and so that's why I quit Northwestern, and I made a very public case of it. And Northwestern actually was quite embarrassed over it, but never did undo the censorship over that. And then I've not taken an academic job since for a large part because I don't think academia is a safe place for people like me right now in terms of people who are willing to call out corporate problems. And that was the problem at Northwestern, was the branding, was the corporatization of the university system, where basically if somebody gets upset with you, then you're bad for the brand. I think universities are supposed to be places where we're anti-brand. The whole concept of a university is the ability to have many, many, many different viewpoints, many diverse ideas, many different forms of inquiry, not to have a single mission. And a brand, by its very nature, has a single mission. It has a swoosh, it has a thing like that, it has, a marketing symbol, it has a brand. And I don't like brands in universities. I like universities as being disruptive, challenging, unpredictable places of thought.
Well, now's about the time for general Q&A. So if people are interested in posing questions, just raise your hand and we'll get you a mic.
Hello?
There's one up there. Oh, oops, okay.
Oh,
Right.
Hi, Dr. Dreger.
Hi.
So you're talking about how research, especially sensitive research, is insanely susceptible to being spun to the interests of whoever picks it up. What's been your response to the claim that the distinction between an orientation and a paraphilia is inherently moralistic?
So just so people understand, paraphilia is a word that's historically been used to refer to what colloquially we would call kinks, and those are thought of as different from orientations. I actually think that that's just basically a social construction, what ends up in the category of orientation and what ends up in the category of paraphilia, and I don't think there's anything wrong with paraphilias. And actually, the most recent DSM makes this pretty clear, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual makes clear that paraphilias are not a problem. When paraphilias become a problem is when they cause somebody to have problems within their lives for other reasons. So for example, if a paraphilia, for example, a foot fetishism causes you to steal shoes, then you have a problem, and then that becomes something where you can seek help if that's causing you problems within your life. But being a foot fetishist is not a problematic thing as long as you're pursuing pleasure and consent and participating in it in a way that has consensual relationships. So I don't really think that there's a moral problem at all with paraphilias, and I don't see sexual orientations as having moral valence either. I don't think that sexual orientations are either inherently good or inherently bad. Orientations are not something we choose. What turns you on is not something you've gone out and decided to have turn you on, and it's apparently not something we can change as far as we can tell. And therefore, the real question for me is not what turns you on, how do you feel? The question is, how do you behave in the world that is a way that is respectful of yourself and respectful of others? And that's really where we have to think about the moral distinctions.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. That I learned a lot. That was a great experience.
Good.
And I wanted to kind of ask.
Good for me too.
I'm glad.
Sorry.
I wanted to
Problem
ask.
when I go to religious schools, like I'm so inappropriate. Did they just turn off my mic?
I wanted to ask a sort of politically tinged question. So you spoke earlier about some interpretations of academic freedom simultaneously being hampered by the idea that the search for truth always has to be to the specific benefit of the search for justice. But simultaneously, in the political world, sort of subjective obscurantism is becoming like an increasingly large, at least from my perspective, is becoming an increasingly large problem in the idea of denying truth in general. So I think it's kind of, to an extent, attacks on the pursuit of truth are coming from both angles and within academia itself as well. So in what kind of ways can we, sort of as students, as citizens, as politically engaged people, help to protect and preserve the search for truth while also using that to search for justice, and while also not allowing sort of this kind of obscurantism to stop the search for truth from happening?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that you should try to do is spend time in nonpartisan spaces mentally. And this is a very difficult thing to do in this world, because all over the place in this world, people want you to be drawn into partisan positions. So if you read the average newspaper, it is full of opinion pieces that are supposed to be directed at pushing you towards a particular view. If you go on YouTube, the studies are now showing us that YouTube will push you down, and not because they mean to do this, but because the algorithms are trying to figure out what will trip you the most intensely. They're constantly sending you down an ever farther train of where your original position was, making you more and more extremist. Part of the reason this is happening is money and corporatization. And I know I sound like I keep harping on this, but it's true. Places like the New York Times have discovered that they have a very passionate liberal base. And in order to make sure that they have the money that they want in order to do journalism and to live good lives, they create an opinion page that's very much directed towards inflaming liberals in a particular way, but then soothing them in a particular way. And I think that what is ended up happening is that we are constantly being used, pushed into partisan spaces for the benefit of other people. So how can you spend time in nonpartisan spaces? Well, one of the things you can do is to work on descriptive work rather than normative work. Normative work is where you're trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong. Descriptive work is simply trying to understand what is in the world. It's the is, not the ought. So trying to do the kinds of work within your schooling where you're simply trying to find out what's true about something descriptively is a way to begin to pull back from the constant pull of the ought. The other thing you can do is try very hard to spend respectful dialogue time with people that you would not really want to spend time with. And those are people who have very different political viewpoints from your own, and trying to find ways to actually sit down with them and have a long conversation in which you try to figure out each other's point of view. And one of the ways you can do that is actually an attempt to yourself say what their position is and have them say what your position is, and try to understand each other in that way until you can begin to get to a place that doesn't feel so much like the two of you are opposed and can never come into a single space. That's not quite nonpartisanship, but it is a place where you can get at least bipartisanship and thinking across things. And I don't mean Democrat, Republican. I mean various kinds of issues, whatever the issue is. So doing that kind of work can really help us begin to get to places in the world, I think, where we begin to have the ability to change our minds. What troubles me is the degree to which people are incapable of changing their minds because they become so rigid in their approach, they can't imagine changing their position on something. And that's really dangerous. So I was talking earlier, I run a newspaper now for the people of East Lansing, which I ended up doing because of Galileo's middle finger for various reasons. Part of it was it allowed me to just hide quietly in my town. And part of it was that I really wanted to understand what happens if we take epistemology and take nonpartisanship into the wild and try to create a news organization. But one of the things that's happened there recently is the city of East Lansing decided to basically throw out a family from the farmers market because at their farm 3 towns away, they refused to host same-gender weddings. At our farmers market, they were selling apples and there was no gender issue. They're just selling apples. But at their farm 3 towns away, they host weddings and they're a Catholic family and they refuse to host same-gender weddings. So our city decided to change its policy and throw them out of the farmers market. That family then got connected with Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a deep-pocket conservative religious rights group, who's now suing our city, and it's costing us a fortune. If you look at what happens on the comments section of our Facebook report, when we report on this on the Facebook reporting, is the liberals in my town scream at the conservatives, "You're intolerant," and the conservatives scream back, "You're intolerant," and like they're using all caps to scream at the other side is intolerant. And it just feels so ridiculous and ironic, where there's no place for them to come together and say, is it possible that we have differing values but could reach some principles together? Come up with some principles by which we could at least agree on the principle, if not the enactment of the principle. These are the kinds of places where I think we have to go. I think we need to spend more time talking principles and less talking about the enactment of the principles per se, and try really hard to spend time in nonpartisan spaces. And that can be uncomfortable. Discomfort is productive. You know how we say about exercise, no pain, no gain? The mind is the same way. No pain, no gain.
Hello. So I actually did. I also have a question about Serrano. Sorry, I've been asked about her multiple times, but she talks about how there is substantial evidence that sexualizing any group can have a negative social impact for them. For example, in young cis women, it's been shown that it has a measurable effect on them, and people can, especially like an example that everyone might relate to is street harassment, being sexualized without it describing your experience, or without your consent, or without any of these components. This, like, when you're talking about androphilia and autogynephilia, a lot of trans women feel that this doesn't describe their experience. And like you said, there hasn't been a lot of research on it. And the research that there has been have been mainly from specifically Bailey and Blanchard.
No, actually, there's been a lot more research than that.
Oh, okay. Well, that's great.
Serrano doesn't actually accurately represent the scientific literature.
Okay. So whether or not Serrano does, there are many people. But, like, do you think that, like, specifically with regards to the claim that this can be sexualizing in a way that doesn't represent people's experience, because there are trans women who think that this doesn't fit them, that
right,
it is
it makes sense, right, to say that there can be people who think that what you're saying about them isn't true, but it could still be true?
It could still be true for some people, but that doesn't mean that it would be something with which to divide all trans women into two groups, right? So, like,
right, I don't think anybody thinks there's only two types of ways you arrive at being a transgender woman.
Okay, that's really great. That is the answer to my question.
And I think Serrano has misrepresented Bailey and Blanchard in that way.
Okay, well, I mean, she did respond specifically in what I read to something that was a quote from Bailey, that some women who are trans women are so uniquely suited to prostitution because of the fact that they are autogynephilic.
No, he was actually talking about androphilic at that point.
Oh, I'm sorry, misused the word. But, like, that was kind of, it felt like a valid critique even if it was from an invalid point.
Yeah, that was a really obnoxious line in his book, and I've written about why that's a really obnoxious line. And actually, I have a quote from my, actually, I guess it wasn't from my friend Kira, it was from another transgender woman who said that saying that androphilic transgender women like doing sex work is like saying people in famine areas like dieting. And I thought that was a really good analogy. The point of the critique saying what you're seeing is limited options, and you're interpreting that as choice. And that was a really good critique of Bailey. Bailey is, I don't agree with everything he's written by any means. If you read the article I've written about him or the book I've written about him, I criticize him all over the place. I also think he's right in a lot of places. Julia Serrano is a useful person in terms of a useful scholar, the way that she approaches stuff, but she's not always honest in the way that she approaches the representation of other people's scholarship. And that's troubling to me.
Hi, if I could take it back to the portion of the conversation about academic freedom. You mentioned at one point, I believe, that you think most of the time academics should be able to research just about what they want, even if it seems on the surface sort of useless or non-pragmatic. But then you also mentioned that, let's say you knew someone who was researching a topic that seemed like it could just have such a high social cost that you would discourage them from doing that kind of research. I'm wondering if you think that that sort of discouraging should just take place at a personal, individual level, like the academic at the end of the day should be able to weigh those social consequences by themselves, or if you think that a sort of structure should be built into the university itself that is doing that social weighing.
Better knowledge always comes from more minds. So the conversations that we have with each other, I think, will always lead to more productive thoughtfulness in terms of both research and also the issues of responsibility. More people, better in general. That was actually the big innovation on the part of the Founding Fathers. Historically speaking, where knowledge came from was from above, and the Founding Fathers actually invented crowdsourcing. They didn't invent it in a vacuum. The scientific revolution was going on at the same time. And across the Western culture was this concept of more minds better. So within science, we developed for the first time in modern science the idea of peer review, the idea of collaboration, the idea of repeatability. And the Founding Fathers adapted that and took that directly into the democratic system. Repeatability in terms of looking at the ability to use voting, use jury systems, all of that kind of stuff was about crowdsourcing and increasing the knowledge that comes from the wisdom of many minds. So democracy and science grew up together, and that's what we still need in the academy, is the idea of many minds bringing more light to a subject. Sometimes working alone can be productive in its own way, but it doesn't really produce as good knowledge as if you're checking with other people in the end.
Kind of as a follow-up question in regards to having more minds focused on one, you discussed earlier how moral implications can keep somebody either from weighing things in a sense that they shouldn't be publicized or they shouldn't be furthered with research, whereas for some individuals, their morals might not match societal morals. So how would you weigh that in the sense of saying that somebody's morals for research might differ from the societal morals, and from them moving forward wanting to go to a research saying, well, I see where this might go, but I don't necessarily disagree with that. Should they then be should there be an intervention then from a societal aspect, or should it still be that person and that researcher's choice to continue moving forward, even if their morals aren't represented in a societal way?
That's a really good question. I think it's really difficult to know the answer to that. So the whole issue of a moral minority is very challenging. Historically speaking, a lot of the people who ended up founding really incredibly good social movements were moral minorities for a long time. In other words, they were people who were on the fringe, and they ended up historically being seen as right. So, for example, people who pushed for civil rights, people who pushed for women's rights, people who pushed for disability rights, in many circumstances were sort of seen as having strange sets of morals that didn't really match the norms within a culture. When do we have that situation? When do we have somebody who's truly dangerous? And when do we have somebody who's just different? It is really difficult to understand. We obviously have to have checks and balances if somebody is doing something that is going to affect other people. But to what extent do we allow people to just do their own thing is a really difficult question.
So, you stated that that you think part of the mark of an advanced society is like a willingness and a tendency to study things that have no immediate application and which are meaningful to individuals but not necessarily on a broadly practically applicable scale. Mm-hmm. So to what degree do you believe that a hyper-competitive profits-based economic system limits academic freedom in that sense?
It absolutely does. And it's one of the reasons why I was glad to leave the academic system was because I felt like it was getting to the point where all we were being judged on in research universities was grants, not knowledge production. The point of grants was supposed to be that it allowed us to do research that led to knowledge production. But today, many faculty members within university systems are judged not at all on how good their work is. They're judged on how much money they're bringing in. They're basically salespeople within a system that treats them as if they are on commission for the corporation, which is the university. And that is a crappy way to do work, because what ends up happening is you simply chase where the dollars are. You don't go where the interesting work is. I'm super lucky because I'm partnered romantically and economically to somebody who makes a lot more money than I do and has stable health insurance. And the consequence of that is that he has allowed me to do the work that I want to do without worrying about the money. So we've had a partnership economically between the two of us where basically he does his career. He's a physician and a university administrator. He's a medical school dean at Michigan State. And he loves the work he does, but he recognizes that it totally liberates me to do the work that I want to do because I don't have to worry about our health insurance and I don't have to worry about my income. And he's allowed me to do huge amounts of work, and that makes him happy and it makes me happy. But if I had to live singly within the university system, I couldn't do nearly the work I've done. The work I've managed to do, I've done because I've been economically free of that system. And I'll tell you, at Northwestern, I did not have tenure. I was not on a tenure track line. So I had tenure at Michigan State, and I quit. And I didn't quit because I didn't like anything at Michigan State. I quit because I'd had a kid, and I was shocked to discover I really liked being a mother. I set out to do motherhood intentionally, but I was still kind of surprised at how much I liked my son. And I really enjoyed having a developmental thing with me that was really fascinating to me. And I also really like construction sites. And he really liked construction sites. So I quit my job and we hung out at construction sites. And I brought a book to read and he brought chucks to play with and we had a great time together. And I ended up working long distance part-time, mostly because I was doing motherhood on the side, or primarily, and then doing work on the side. But at Northwestern, they would not give me tenure on a part-time long distance job. And so I worked without tenure. So almost all of the work you see in Galileo's middle finger was done outside of the tenure system. And the reason I could do that was because I had the security of knowing my husband had health insurance and we had an income on his side and I didn't have to worry if I lost my job. When I was silent for 12 months about the censorship at Northwestern, the reason I was silent was because my colleagues needed their jobs and needed their health insurance. And that is why I stayed silent, because I was really scared that they were going to lose their jobs over this. And so the corporatized, scary system, the system in America where we do not have anything like national health insurance, leaves people in a very hampered place. If we had national health insurance in this country, we would have more local newspapers because people could afford to do news and still have health insurance. We would have more art. We would have more people doing history. We would have more people able to stay home with their children. We would have so many more things you could do on the low economic end of the spectrum because you would have the social safety net of health insurance. What we have in this country is a system where a lot of people have to make a lot of choices based on things that is not primarily what they are called to do in their lives, but they're doing it because they're reasonable people who are scared of otherwise not having a system whereby if they get in a car accident, they could lose everything. Hang on,
And
Ashley. Ashley?
Hello?
Yep.
Yeah. So we have a bunch of healthcare economics students in the audience, and I know you've worked in the past to change injustices in the healthcare system that were built into the system. I'd like to know, to what degree do you think there are things in the system right now that in the future we'll look back at and condemn and realize how bad they were, and what are the best ways of going about changing that kind of injustice in the system?
I don't know the answer to how to change it, but I will say I think one thing we will look back and be absolutely shocked at is the lack of mental health care support. absolutely shocking that we have systems whereby, for example, if you have a child born with intersex genitals, you can absolutely get surgery paid for in public health insurance and in private health insurance, but you cannot get counseling for yourself. You cannot get social work help for your child as they grow older. You can't get them psychological help, but you can absolutely get one surgery after another and hormones galore for that child. But you can't get, even though we recognize that the issue is not a medical issue, the issue is an issue of stigma and shame and confusion. It's a mental health issue that we treat with surgery and hormones. We know that we have a major mental health crisis in actually the generation of undergraduates, and yet we have almost no system in most places. I mean, colleges do provide some level of assistance, but it's shocking the degree to which it is very difficult for the average person to have access to a therapist. I think it is stunning, absolutely stunning, that we have this system in America. Therapy is not even that expensive, and we know it helps. So that, to me, is really shocking. I think one of the other things we'll look back and be quite shocked at is the amount of money we waste at the end of life on people who don't want that wasted. I'm not talking about the people who do want those interventions. I'm talking about people who don't want those interventions and who are ready to go and who are sent into systems that endlessly harm them through medicalization, when in fact what they need is hospice care. And at the beginning of life, what we have is a situation where pregnancy and birth is hyper-medicalized, insanely expensive. We have a C-section rate that's now at about 35%. If you look at what C-section rates should be, they should be somewhere between 5 and 8% in terms of the actual need for cesarean sections. We have an insane system that medicalizes and introduces danger at birth, and I think someday we'll look back at that and recognize that that has been incredibly wasteful and really dangerous. The United States has an insane infant mortality rate given the advanced technology and science that we have. And why is that? Because we hypermedicalize birth, and we also don't take care of people during pregnancy. We don't provide adequate care like a lot of places do. We also don't provide adequate postpartum care, where we don't help mothers with professional people who come to them and help them understand how to manage early motherhood. In many places that are industrialized, there are women who are paid for by the government who are assigned to go to mothers and help them understand how to manage in the first few months. Because how to manage in the first few months is bewildering if you've never done it before. And we have very few systems developed to assist mothers in that way. Newborns are like these freaky things that are very, very confusing. And they won't let you sleep, so they become ever more confusing. And our rate of postpartum depression in this country is very high, and it would be different if we had a less broken healthcare system.
How do we compare with other...
Right Where here, are you?
Right here.
Thank you.
This is a little dicey. How do we compare with other countries in the world with our mental health care? I mean, I know Japan is not particularly good with their care. But how do we compare with other countries in the world with our mental health care?
I haven't looked at it lately, but in most places that have some degree of socialized health care, there is built-in mental health care to at least some degree. And in this country, it's really quite woeful. Even private insurance in this country is not expected to have anything like mental health parity. And it's really troubling. So if you talk to people who work in psychology and psychiatry, what they will tell you is it's very easy to get insurance systems to pay for drugs, and it's very hard to pay for talk therapy. And drugs can help, but talk therapy often helps without side effects.
You know, Alice, one thing that leapt out from your book when I read it was one sentence. Science is not just another way of knowing, you said. And it's interesting to me because there is a kind of mantra, if not a dogma today, in the academy, which suggests that there are many ways of knowing, and science is just one way of knowing. So when you make that claim that science is not just a way of knowing, what do you mean?
I mean, historians can be very good and work very hard, and they will never build an airplane that will fly. philosophers can be incredibly helpful and really brilliant, and they will never develop an antibiotic that works. The reason that science is not just another way of knowing is that it does intervention and testing in the world and develops things that actually work. And that is unusual in terms of the testability. So I'm all for the humanities. I'm actually a big advocate of the humanities because I think quality, it's like mental health care, right? You can have the sciences, but at the end of the day, if you want to understand who you are, I'm sorry, a geneticist is not going to tell you who you are. A philosopher is going to help you figure out who you are. So we need those things, absolutely. But science has a particular ability to figure out physical reality in the world. And understanding physical reality in the world empowers us in a way other things will not empower us.
So earlier in your speech, you were talking about the flaws of the academic system in the modern day. And many people, including controversial professor Jordan Peterson, discuss the role of the academy and the university in the modern day. And Jordan Peterson himself discusses that the university can now be said, one of the places where the university is sourced nowadays is on the internet, due to its ability to spread information for free and in an efficient manner. So what are your thoughts on the current day academic system in relation to the internet, brands of colleges, and where that should go in the future?
Yeah. You know, we were talking a little bit about this earlier. When I was in 7th grade and 8th grade and 10th grade, and we were doing sex ed, and I was in New York, so it was a fairly liberal public school system, the only place we really could get information was either from our health teachers or from our father's pornography. Those were our choices. And my father wasn't using pornography, so I didn't have that available to me. So I had my health teacher who would tell me things. But basically, I didn't feel like I could ask my health teacher about sexual stuff. So I was very limited in what I could find out about the sexual reality, unless I went to the library and took out books like Our Bodies, Ourselves, and then I could begin to understand stuff. My son, by contrast, my son was born in the year 2000. My son, by contrast, has the internet available to him. By the time he hit sex ed, he knew so much more than his teacher knew because he had bothered to, like everything else in his life, go and read. And the other kids in the class were the same way. Many of them had gone ahead and read. And by that age, by 10th grade or 11th grade, a lot of you have actually seen pornography in a level I certainly was not exposed to. That doesn't mean you're learning good or correct stuff or helpful stuff, but it does mean you're exposed and you're able to get a lot more information. That is true in almost everything in your life. You are able to access vastly more information than ever before. And I think it does create a question of what the heck universities are for if you're able to access that stuff. The reason I dropped out of college when I was 19 was exactly this. It was the problem where I felt like I was being told by my professors what I should read and what I should think about. And I felt like, screw that. There's the public library. I don't need them. I can go and discover the world myself. And I had already been using university libraries. I knew I could go use university libraries. So what is a college supposed to be for? Well, my feeling is a college exists to interact with you in a way that enables you to learn better than you can alone with the internet. So what you should have is fellow class members and professors who are challenging you in a way that actually changes the way you're thinking about stuff, or at least opens you up to thinking about things in a way you would not otherwise do if you're simply on the internet. If that's not happening, then you should drop out of school. And you should find ways to do that. Because I did that, and that was way more satisfying, in fact, than sticking in a system where basically I was a passive learner. The danger is that within university systems, because we've very understandably tried to make sure we're taking care of people who've been marginalized and harmed, we have a situation where we don't want to upset them too much. And so we end up in a situation where we're bringing you into a college environment, and what we should be doing is disturbing you, but we don't want to disturb you because disturbing you would be bad because you may have a history that's a troubled history, and we don't want to make it worse. So we're in this weird dialectic where we're supposed to figure out, well, how do we take care of you and also make you uncomfortable when in fact we're not supposed to be making you uncomfortable because we're being told that's not what we're supposed to do. And also, you're not going to want to adhere to the brand if we make you too uncomfortable, right? So what ends up happening is you get these college brochures where every class is portrayed as if it's outside in the courtyard. And nobody is supposed to actually make you very upset. We're supposed to light you up, but not upset you at all, not challenge you. This is ridiculous. What you should want out of your classes is to be uncomfortable. I'm telling you, the best education you could possibly get is an education in which your professors make you uncomfortable psychologically in terms of your education. That you are being exposed to ideas that are strange and different and confusing and unsettling. That is a sign that you're getting something worth your tuition dollars. If what you want is a space that is extremely comforting, okay, but when you leave here, you're not going to have any more skill than when you came. In fact, you're probably going to have less skill because, in fact, you're going to have lived in a bubble in a world that is so unrealistic in terms of what you're actually going to be facing in the real world. It's done you a disservice. So when I was teaching undergraduates, I made a point of constantly letting them know that I thought my job was for all of us, including me, to be in the room getting uncomfortable together in terms of our learning. And that was the point. And I asked the students to trust me, and we trusted each other, and we did that work. In fact, as I was telling one of the people in the center earlier, one of the things I asked my students to do was I required them to do, write papers criticizing my curriculum, criticizing me as a teacher. Not my style and that kind of thing, but what I was teaching. And I actually made them write papers that criticized what I was teaching. And that made me uncomfortable and made them uncomfortable, and then we talked about it, and then I tried to improve the curriculum based on their criticisms. Because that's one of the things I needed to teach them to do, was to go to authority and make authority uncomfortable, but do it in a rational, educated way. That's what we have to do. And if that's happening to you, that's not a sign that St. Olaf is not taking care of you. That's a sign to me it is taking care of you. It is helping you reach places you would not otherwise reach if it's you alone on the internet. I think distance learning is an oxymoron.
So, given that set of considerations, would you say that something like the concept of safe spaces on campus is a misconception or a strategy that's inappropriate or inefficient? Or
when the concept of safe spaces originated, it was really great. And I was one of the people who signed up for the training and got the sticker on my door. And what that was a specific thing to help LGBT students. Those of us who were willing to do this, voluntarily went and got training about if a student was LGBT or thought they might be, and we could put the sticker on the door, they could come to us and they would know we had been trained to help them in terms of helping them figure out where they could go to get really good resources to support them. Peer support group, but also professional support in terms of therapists who would help them and not shame them. So we were trained, and the sticker went on the door, but it was on our office doors. And it meant a student could come in and close the door and say, I think I might be gay. Or could say, I'm having gender questions and I think I might be transgender. And that was the safe environment. Now, when that leaked into the classrooms, I don't know. But that was never meant to be in the classroom, which was supposed to be a place of potential discomfort. The safe space was supposed to be the office, and the faculty were being trained to be sensitive and aware and non-shaming. The main thing we were aiming to do was be non-shaming, to recognize and understand that people did not have to be ashamed of who they were. When that got leaked into classrooms, that became a real problem. And the reason is classrooms have to be places where dangerous ideas can be aired. They have to be places where we are exposed to things that sometimes make us uncomfortable. I don't know if I could go back to universities today and teach, because the stuff I used to teach was really unsettling stuff. So one of the things I did, for example, when I taught the history of birth, was to show people a video, which was a video made in the 1950s of an African-American community that had active midwives women taking care of their own women. And it showed women birthing. So it showed their pudenda with the baby coming out. I don't know that I could today even use something like that. I used to teach texts that were defenses of pedophilia. I was not comfortable with these texts, but I thought my students needed to read somebody analogizing so-called pedophilic rights with gay rights. I found that very troubling, morally problematic, a very difficult analogy, but we read it together and we talked about it together. I'm not sure I could do that today. And I think that's really problematic because my students, I think there's a reason my students every year gave me Teacher of the Year award, and that was not because I made them comfortable. Except in my office, where I tried very hard to make them comfortable. I did not make them comfortable. So what do we want out of university educations? I think we want a situation where you're at risk of having somebody say something or inject an idea that is threatening, bizarre, uncomfortable. Should we have limits on that? Absolutely, we should have limits on that. For example, we should not allow a student to come in and strip naked, right? Even though that student may be trying to make a point about their body. There are some limits to what we should do, but let's talk about those limits and push them as far as we can in the interest of really engaging. This is the last place in the universe where you can do that kind of work. And it's the last chance in your life, in many cases, to do that deep, heavy intellectual work. After this, not a lot of space exists, unfortunately.
So I want to sort of follow up on that about how the classroom should be a space that challenges you intellectually and like presents you with uncomfortable ideas. I want to ask if you believe everyone should be held to the same standards in terms of dealing with discomfort. Like to take a concrete example, should someone who is the victim of pedophilia in their lives also be asked to sit in that class and maintain the same sort of like composure, or like, do you think that people who like have had unique experiences which might like make certain topics potentially traumatic, should they be held to this the same sort of like standards of it's okay to make these people uncomfortable for the sake of helping them learn?
So if a person has had a history of trauma where they're in a situation where that issue of trauma coming up in the classroom could re-traumatize them and cause them a problem, they have a disability. There is no shame in having a disability. In that case, what is needed is a disability accommodation. And the disability accommodation in that case might be not being in class during that. Or talking with the professor about if that's going to come up, we need to pause and allow this person to leave and to do an alternative assignment. There is no shame in having had a history of trauma and recognizing that you might have a disability based on that history of trauma. But the way to deal with it is not to change the entire classroom setting to accommodate. It is to do disability accommodation in a way that is respectful of everybody in the room. So if we have a situation, for example, where somebody is a blind, let's say a person who is a non-hearing person, that person absolutely legitimately might need an interpreter, a sign interpreter in the room, who can sign for that person and allow that person to participate actively in the class. We're not going to say, because that person can't hear, none of us can speak. Right? We're going to say, that person has a disability, there is absolutely no shame in it, we will do accommodation. And that's what I would say, is that for a person who has that kind of trauma, we do disability accommodation. And we recognize it as a legitimate disability. Those are real. Those are absolutely real issues.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our time. Thank you very much, Alice.
I just want to remind you, we're going to be across the hall.
There will be the possibility of informal
Happy to talk more.
conversation follow-up for those who want to follow up on some things.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.